As always, link to the source code and video transcript in the description. Unfortunately, functions in Godot are not first-class objects, meaning we can't just pass them around like any other variable like we can in languages like JavaScript or Python. In case you're unfamiliar with first-class functions, here's what I mean. In this JavaScript example, I can create a function named callback function, store a reference to it as a variable, and then pass that variable around, such as into my function where I can internally call it, or I can just add parentheses after the variable on a new line and call the function that way. With first-class functions, you can treat a function just like it's any other object. This usage is pretty common and useful in a language like JavaScript since you're often dealing with a lot of asynchronous web requests on a website. First-class functions make it easy to request some data, let the program continue on its way, and jump back to the callback function once it has a response. This can also apply to a game development context, either directly by, say, requesting data from a game server, or maybe running an expensive AI calculation in the background of your game while it continues to run, or by writing a generic object that can be used in multiple contexts, such as having a generic spell object and feeding it different functions to call when cast based off of what specific type of spell it is. The code for the spell might look like this. Assuming that cast fire and cast lightning are defined somewhere else in our code, we can use one spell class to create different types of spells. So in these examples, writing some generic code and getting a specific output makes things easier, and so the lack of first-class functions in GDScript is kind of a bummer, but we can get that functionality back with the use of FuncRefs. The Godot documentation sums up FuncRefs pretty nicely. By creating a FuncRef object using the built-in FuncRef function in GDScript, a reference to a function in a given object can be created, passed around, and called. And so a FuncRef is an object that allows for equivalent functionality of a first-class function, and creating it is as simple as the documentation makes it look. We just call the FuncRef function and pass two arguments: the object that owns the function that you want a reference to, and the name of the function as a string. To call the function that this reference is storing, you can just call the callFunc function on that object. And if you have arguments that need to be passed into the function, you can pass them like normal. As a brief example of this, let's build upon the spell casting system that I demonstrated earlier and build a spell crafting system, where the player can craft the spell from multiple elements and then cast it, getting the combined effects of their choices. The lone sample scene for today has a series of check buttons to toggle each element on and off so the player can choose what they want. It has a button to create and cast the spell, and then a few particle emitters representing each element so there's some visual feedback. Let's first take a look at the spell class, which is going to take a series of FuncRefs to other functions and then call them all together when it's cast, thereby letting us combine different elements together. These functions could be stored anywhere, and they most likely would live within their own objects in the actual game somewhere else. But to keep things simple for this example, the code for the main scene is going to define the cast functions, which just turn their associated particle emitters on or off depending on if they're selected. When we click the cast spell button, we first create the spell, adding a FuncRef for each selected element to the array of elements the spell should use. We then call spell.cast, which will go through its array of casting functions and call them. Running the code, we can play around with the quite small selection of elements and create a custom spell with different effects based on what we select, all from an extremely generic spell class. Obviously, this example is quite minimal, but hopefully it helps demonstrate how you can use function references to build a more flexible code base by writing a generic piece of code that can take on specialized functionality. And that's really all I want to say about FuncRefs. If you're looking for a way to implement callback functions or pass function references around, FuncRef is what you need. I'll link to the Godot documentation in the description if you want to know more.